appreciate that. Real quick, for those who may have not joined us for previous ones, my name is Aaron Ortiz. I work with WGR Southwest. We're an environmental health and safety company. We help people stay in compliance with local laws and regulations. And my particular specialty is the industrial general stormwater permit. My job is to help people stay in compliance with that. Keeps me busy because California in 2015, California revised the excuse me, the permit and made it a lot more interesting. I'll put it that way. So great. I'm glad those could welcome us. Just to recap, in the first part of my three-part series, we talked about the general permit, where it came from, how it starts with the Clean Water Act and where the Clean Water Act came from and all that, and how we got it today. And then we talked about the elements of the permit that are in it, the good housekeeping and different types of BMPs and things like that. The second half, we talked about monitoring, about what the permit requires you to do, which is you have your monthly monitoring, you have your stormwater monitoring, your stormwater sampling. Also, someone mentioned about where the water goes, how you're supposed to send it to a lab for analytical testing, stuff like that. We can go into more detail, but with the 1 hour format, I really am limited on answering, or really basically have to touch briefly on this. But we cut all the essentials out. Now, what I like about this third one is a few years ago, the Water Board, in conjunction with us, we helped them create a training video for people with my certification. I am a QIS, a Qualified Industrial Stormwater Practitioner. In 2015, big mouthful. In 2015, the permit created a certificated position called QIS, Qualified Stormwater Industrial Practitioner, Stormwater Practitioner. And what that is people who have experience in stormwater and people who know the permit that came out together, so that way they can help people with the general permit. Because one of the water board noticed was a lot of people were putting a lot of money and trouble into things where it wasn't necessary for them to necessarily put that much. Other times, people weren't doing anything or not following the rules, either through ignorance or through outright just, most of the time they just didn't know. So the problem is they created someone with my certification process. So that way they could, like my certification I have, they created that. So that way people have someone who's knowledgeable who could help them with their permit compliance. And that's why you have the ERA processes, which we talked about in my previous part 2. Where we talk about how if you go over the expectations or the levels, any else, that then you can have someone who has that knowledge help walk you through the process, help with your reports. We call them ERA reports, things like that. So then this one here, the Water Board wanted to help QISPs, people like us, go through different scenarios concerning how to grab samples, the best way to approach collecting samples, because there's a lot of good advice out there. And there are many people who are, I'm sure, a lot smarter than me. They give some great advice and they'd like to pass on some of that advice to all of us QISPs. But I found the information in that to be quite valuable. So at the end of this presentation, I'm going to pop on that video on demonstrating protocols for sampling, because protocol can really help you or it can hurt you. So right now, let's go over the cost for this particular one. This workshop is to review some of the different sampling situations and recommendations on how to collect samples, okay? And so skipping down, this 3-part workshop series is designed to help meet with what you need. So let's talk about it. First, we're going to talk about the goal of this workshop. Then we're going to go on to talk about representative sampling, because you're supposed to grab samples that aren't cleaner than what they represent, but not dirtier. You're supposed to be representative. They represent what's leaving your property. And then we're talking about smart sampling techniques. Don't shoot yourself in the foot. And then we're going to follow with that Water Board with some great practical suggestions on how to go about doing stormwater sampling. So the Industrial General Water Permit gives sample guidance in Attachment H. In the opening paragraph of Attachment H, it recommends using the EPA's Industrial Stormwater Monitoring and Sampling Guide, which came out in 2009. This was a revision of one that came out in 1992. For the sake of time, given the 1 hour format, we're going to give you some quick general tips and recommendations for performing compliance IGP sampling followed by the instructional video. So I've said this before, but it's bears repeating. Don't shoot yourself in the foot. If you sample carelessly, if you don't have some forethought into how you grab samples, it can cause you unnecessary issues. Remember, you want to collect samples that represent the water, the quality and quantity of water leaving your property. It's not supposed to be cleaner. In other words, you're not supposed to get it. There used to be some people where they have a couple of places where water leaves your property, poison discharge, which I refer to as outfalls. And they'll grab samples from this one because they know this one's always clean. So they grab samples from that one, but they don't grab samples from where water's coming from a lot of industrial areas. That's not representative. So that's one of the reasons why, if there's more than one outfall, they want you to grab samples from each outfall. So that way you can, and then that's why they do composite sampling if things are the same, which is rare. Or basically you grab your samples and then you add them up and do the average. So the whole point is they want a good representative of what's actually leaving your property in total. Get a good representative of that. One example I have years ago, I had a client where they had 3 ponds, and one pond would drop to another pond, drop to another pond. And it was great. The water numbers were always great. And then, in fact, I talked about this yesterday at the keynote session. If you haven't seen the keynote I did with Rich Mall and Lowell Cottle, you should see it. It's really got some good information. I had a chance to sit down and talk to a couple of Regional Water Control Board regulators, and they had some good advice and basically how they want to work as a partnership with you and helping you get your site into compliance with the general permit. And there are a lot of good things in the discussion. I recommend it. If you go back, it'll be on our website. I'm sure at the end here, Rebecca can give you more information on that. But I talked about how they grab samples. They grab samples from where fresh pylons have been poured with concrete, and they walked in with their boots on, and they dug up all this stuff, grab samples, and next thing you know, they have high solids and they have high pH. And basically, it's because it wasn't that they actually had high solids and pH. It's because where they grabbed their samples was on the opposite side of where the water left the pond. And you're supposed to grab samples from the last place water leaves your property. So I said, first of all, guys, don't ever walk into the middle of a pond. Use a sampling boom and grab your sample, boom that can hold on to your bottles, and grab your samples that way so you don't have to disturb the water. And 2, grab the samples from where water is leaving, because it's supposed to be representative of what's leaving your property, not what's coming into a pond. And 2, after a year or so, the pH balances stuff out because, concrete cures and the pH balances out. But even if I bet you if they grabbed the sample from the proper location the previous year, it would have been fine because the pH would have neutralized by the time it got to the end of the pond. So how they grabbed that sample totally wrecked their numbers. And by goodness, everything averaged out okay, but it was close. So Section 2.2 of the EPA guide describes a representative sample as discharges prior to the stormwater leaving your facility and at a location downstream, in other words, down from where you started, from all your other industrial materials activities. The reason behind requiring such a location is so that the sample is representative of your facility's discharge, taking into account the types of pollutants that may be contained in the runoff from the property. I've also seen people do something where they grab samples, they have these BMPs in place, best management practices. We talked about that in Section 1 quite a bit, Part 1. They have filtering devices and they have things, and they grab a sample before it enters their BMP and not after. Remember, you're supposed to grab samples of water leaving your property, but they grab samples of water that had not been filtered yet. They grab samples there, and then the water goes through their filtration, leaves, and I bet you the water leaving was perfectly fine, but they grab their water upstream of their filtration. That's why at a storm drain, let's just say if you sample a storm drain, well, you'll see that in the video, but basically if you have BMPs in the storm drain where you're grabbing samples, when you pull them out of the way to grab your sample, there goes your BMP. And it kind of defeats the purpose. Remember, a representative sample should reflect the quality and quantity of your facility's stormwater discharges. So they want you to grab samples from the last place that water leaves your property. So smart sampling starts with planning ahead. So this permit talks a lot about procedures or whatever, and it makes a lot of sense. A little planning can go a long way. Have an understanding of what the IGP general permit, IGP's Industrial General Stormwater Permit, or as I refer to it, general permit, requires in terms of monitoring. Then you can see section 11 of the general permit. Also, if you see part 2, which we just did earlier today, it kind of goes over a lot of that. You should have a compliant stormwater pollution prevention plan, a SWEP, which will include the monitoring implementation plan, MIP. Basically, some people make those two as like one document. We like to have like 2 separate documents that we bring together. And so either way, as long as they're both in your binder, that's what matters. Okay, the MIP should include descriptions of what you're sampling for and where your sample locations are. Okay, you should have an account with the Environmental Laboratory Accreditation Program laboratory, ELAB certified. So if you have samples and you go to a lab that's not ELAB certified, they may not consider your sample results legitimate. It has to be ELAB certified lab. You have to have stormwater bottles and equipment ready for the season. So if you don't have your bottles yet, the rain's coming, get your bottles, order your bottles. Also, if you have partially filled out change of companies, I recommend it. So in other words, get your chain of custody. It's that paper from the time you grab your sample to the time it goes to the lab. That paper follows your samples as a method of tracking for sample integrity. What I recommend is that you get a chain of custody, fill out your address, because that doesn't change, who you are, what you're sampling for, all that. I would get that all pre-filled out. And the only things you want to leave blank are who's grabbing a sample, what time we grab a sample, and what alpha. Basically, that way it's a lot faster. You don't have to fill everything out at the end of the sample, because you'll be chaotic when you're in the middle of grabbing a sample. So my personal recommendation is if you have a chain of custody, fill out as much of it ahead of time as possible. Fill in all the details you can, with the exception of, the days you actually grab sample, the dates, the times. Make sure and I recommend putting your pH results, since you have to grab it within 15 minutes of collecting your sample, write that on your chain of custody. So that way you don't have to worry about documenting somewhere else. It'll be right. So if you have someone like me, a consultant, who helps you process your chain of custody on the ad hocs on the websites, the Smart's website, they don't have to come back and ask you for your pH, because it's already written on the chain of custody. They have it there for them. So as previously stated, smart sampling starts with plan ahead. Give yourselves every chance of a positive sampling result by installing BMPs before the rain starts. So this week, next week, now's the time to grab your samples. In fact, I have a client, I'm going to be helping them get those things installed next week. This week I'm overseeing somebody, but next week we want to get them in now before the rains really start kicking in. Okay. Try to find ways to reduce your stormwater discharges. I mean, the permit even says in section 11 of the permit, or excuse me, section 10H6, 10 of the permit say, hey, this is an advanced BMP. Even if you can't make it meet the standards of what they refer to as a treatment control BMP, still it's a good idea to put one in, because it'll still do some treatment. So if there's some ways you could put berms in, or ponds, or vegetative swales, things where water can be captured and soaked in the ground. If your facility can capture smaller storms and let them soak into the ground, that is a really good idea, because small storms have a tendency to have more pollutants, because you have pollutants that come on the ground and then they're not really quote unquote washed off in a sense. So if you can have a BMPs that have to capture that and be able to have biouptake and have a chance to clean it, I would recommend doing that. Reducing stormwater discharges is one of the advanced BMPs and listen to the IGP, and then I have it there at 10H, and then basically they encourage you to do that. If you could put in ponds, like I said, if you could put in ponds, if you could put in swales, I think it's a great idea. I mean, anything you can do. I have one client where it takes over an inch of rain before they really have flow leaving their property. That's a blessing. A lot of the smaller storms never even get to the storm drain. And if you remember from my last workshop, if you were part of it, you only need to grab samples if they're discharging off your property. If there's no discharge, there should be no sampling. Remember from part 2 of the IGP basics, you only need a sample of discharge, and we just talked about that. It's key. It's key. Many times I have clients where they haven't sampled for years, and because of all the rain we had at the beginning of this year, and we had a bunch of rain, bottom line is that's the first time they've actually had to grab a sample in years, because their ponds have been big enough to hold all the rain that they never had a sample. And so some of them were kind of scrambling to like, how do we do this? So actually, they are the ones that recommend to be in this particular workshop as well, because this will help remind them, should we have another banner year, which there is a good shot that we will be in El Nino year, and it could give us a lot of rain again. So it's a good thing to be reminded. Okay. So if you have berms, you can direct the flow. I have a little client that used to basically redirect their flow to where the water would go over. And then what they'd do is the water would flow, it would sheet flow off of everywhere, and they had a hard time getting a good sample. So all they did was put a small little roll berm, directed the water that was sheet flowing off their property and directed it, and they put in the ground a utility box. And I recommend that because all you do is you pull the cover off and make the bottom of the utility box is permeable. So any water that gets in there is just going to soak away anyway. And then the water from that berm would direct it into the utility box. They'd be able to have room to maneuver their bottles and fill their bottles with the storm water. And then when they're done, they just put the lid back on the utility box, and there's not a trip hazard. And then the water flows back over the top of it and leaves their property. So that was a really great way to do that. In fact, here's an example of it, of a former location. See how they have this, they've glued in berm. It flowed along this berm. It went out right past this utility box. They pull the cover, grab a sample, then put the cover back on, and it worked out really well for them. I refer to it as the legal flush. Basically, remember, the jump permit allows you up to 4 hours during business hours to collect, or within 12 hours prior to business hours for sample collection. If you don't know what I'm talking about, you really should see part 2, the previous part where we talked about this. When discharge starts during your business hours, you have up to 4 hours from the start of discharge, not rain, remember, start of discharge, to collect the sample, okay? Or if rain comes in outside your business hours, like the night before, and as long as the discharge started within 12 hours, you have up to 4 hours from the start of business to collect that sample, okay? We recommend, first of all, as a general rule, not to collect samples within the first 5 minutes of the discharge. Why? Is it because you're trying to cheat the system? Well, no. For example, in my area here at my shop, around us are farmland. In fact, across the freeway from us is farmland. And what happens is every fall when they dredge out, or when they dredge out, or not dredge, but they turn their fields, our cars are covered in dirt. And as you know, most farm fields have what? Fertilizers. And fertilizer are nitrates. And if you're a facility that's looking for nitrates, you know that the first things that's going to land on your property, you know, all that stuff coming from everybody else is landing on your property. And the first 5 minutes is really not going to be representative of leaving your property. It's representative of what everybody else around you is doing. So when rain starts and then you have flow, and you have flow start, we recommend not jumping in and grabbing a sample as soon as flow starts. If you can, now I preface it, if you can wait a little bit, at least 5 minutes, though I recommend more if possible, to grab that sample. That time, everybody else's junk that's on your property, everybody else's stuff, going through your BFPs, everybody else's stuff will flush off, and then you can grab a sample that truly represents what's leaving your property based on your industrial activity. Remember, they don't want it cleaner than it's supposedly supposed to be, you know, there's putting tap water or something illegal like that, but also not dirtier. It needs to be representative. Now, the thing is, if you say, okay, the rain starts, oh, we have flow. Well, I got 4 hours. Forget it. You know, I'll come back later. And then the rain stops and you had a chance to collect a qualifying storm event. In other words, if you don't know what a QSE is, you got to see part 2. If you didn't grab a QSE sample event, and you could have, and you end up not getting any other chances, you're going to have to talk to them in the annual report and say, well, we had a chance for a QSE, but we kind of blew it. Okay, so if you have a QSE, a qualifying storm event, and it meets within the criteria, you know, the 4 hours during business hours, or within the first 4 hours of the day, if it came, you know, outside your business hours the night before, then grab it. So do we recommend you wait? If possible, yes. But if the rain stops and the flow stops, you need to really grab that sample before flow stops. Okay, so yeah, you got 4 hours. And again, real quick, as I mentioned before, if rain starts, you have flow, you grab your stuff. It's happened to me before. Grab my stuff to go, get out there, and the rain goes, stops, and the flow tapers off. And you're like, but then 2 hours later, the rain comes back. As long as you're within that 4 hour window of time, if the rain picks up again and flow starts again, you can grab that sample as long as it's within 4 hours of the start of discharge, or like I said earlier, if it's within the first 4 hours of business from a previous night's discharge where rain starts to begin, okay? You don't want to overfill your bottles, okay? Because some of your bottles, especially oil and grease, have preservatives in it, acids, either nitric, sulfuric acid solution, or maybe NCL, any other like acids, but they basically, these are preservatives designed to help keep your thing straight, okay? So if bottles that have acids, especially for oil and grease, or if you have metals and they have a preservative in it, you don't want to flush that preservative out in your bottle. So let me see, I had a bottle, but you want to grab a sample where it reaches between the shoulder and the bottom of the cap. I recommend grabbing a sample somewhere in between, okay? If it's a total suspended solids bottle, there is no preservative. So if you fill a TSS bottle all the way up and it overflows, no big deal, no preservative. But for oil and grease, for metals, for different types of substances where there's preservative in there, then you like for metal, which is nitric acid, which is a strong acid, you want to fill it up above the shoulder and below the cap if possible. So that way you don't overfill, you don't flush out your preservative. Okay. Two, oil and grease bottles must be collected directly into the laboratory bottle. Okay. Every laboratory, no matter who they are, oil and grease is an amber glass bottle. Okay, it's that brown bottle, and they all have preservative. Oil and grease has preservative. So the rules or protocol for sampling is you can grab samples, and if, for example, if you can't get a bottle filled, you can take a solids bottle or a container, a collection container, and pour it in there. For oil and grease bottles, you need to fill them directly from the flow, because what they're saying is if you use a secondary container and you pour it into the oil and grease bottle, you have oil and grease from your original flow is going to be stuck to the secondary container, and you're going to get a false positive result because you're not getting the water directly. So to the extent feasible, get the flow directly into your oil and grease bottles the best you can, okay, if at all possible. Now, if it's going to cost you a couple $100,000 because you have a flow that leads from a access port, and it's, I understand if there's only so much you can get a swing sampler and try to grab samples that way as best you can. But to the extent feasible, you need to fill the oil and grease bottle directly from the flow, not using any secondary containers. You don't want to scrape or gouge the bottom or sides of the sample location, because then you're artificially creating solids. If you scrape stuff up, you're creating, kind of like my clients did when they walked into the pond with their muck boots on. They walked in, stirred up all these solids, which never would have been stirred up if they hadn't been walking around, like stormtroopers in there. Okay. You don't want to dirty the water by stirring it up unnecessarily. If you're grabbing a sample, don't grab it with the water coming through your feet and you're grabbing a sample that way. Grab the water coming to you, not water that's already passed past you, because again, your feet are going to churn up stuff. In other words, protocol is important. Avoid contaminating the sample by doing the following. Only use clean collection equipment and sample bottles. Okay. It's important for you to store the collection equipment and bottles in a clean location. We have an example of I have a former colleague who's moved on to another position now, but this colleague had done groundwater monitoring, and there was this was back during the time when they were switching on all the gas tanks from gas stations, because a lot of the gas tanks from gas stations had leaked and had tons of diesel and gasoline floating in the water tables underneath gas stations. So we were doing water monitoring for a company, and the things we're using to monitor them, the things were smelt like diesel. And so he put in the back of his truck, and he had clean water in another part of his truck. And we had to do samples where we had to do the clean water as a control sample. The clean water came back with hydrocarbons in it, because it had been, the smell from the things that we had used earlier had penetrated that water bottle and actually contaminated the water. So you want to store your equipment in a place that won't be contaminated. Use nitrile gloves if at all possible, because you don't know what's in the water. I've grabbed samples knowing that there's human fluids in that water. I've grabbed samples knowing that there's other types of human factors in that water. Let's put it that way. So you never know what's in the water. It's safer, be safe than sorry. Just assume there's something in the water that might harm you. Use gloves. You don't want to smoke or drink or eat around your sample bottles. You don't want to open your bottles until you're actually collecting the sample. Okay. You never collect samples near a running vehicle because then you can contaminate your samples. Don't breathe, sneeze, cough, anything in the open container. Remember, you don't open those containers until you're literally grabbing the sample. Okay. And then when you do get your samples, pack them on ice, either blue ice or preferably wet ice, because they need to be maintained at a certain temperature when you head out to the laboratory for processing. The lab will test your pH right away, but they'll also, if you haven't especially, but they'll also do a temperature check on your samples, and they'll document that. Your temperature needs to be kept at a certain temperature, and the way to do that is to pack them in ice. Okay, so I've had clients where they've shipped off their samples from Hawaii to California. They pack them in blue ice when they left, but by the time they get to California, they're room temperature. So the whole point is to keep them cold. If you have a dedicated refrigerator and you have a courier come pick them up, that's fine. But if you have a dedicated refrigerator, you really don't want to. You want to have a dedicated one. You don't want to mix it with food because, ew. I mean, like I said, stormwater can have some pretty nasty stuff. Okay, so in 2019, the Water Board created the training video to give qualified industrial stormwater practitioners, people like me, with some general guidance and approaches to collecting samples. Okay, so this assumes this video, because it was for quiz, it assumes that those watching the video already know the general permit. Okay, you already know the requirements. But to a certain degree, it's still good for the general public because there's a lot of good recommendations in it. Okay, so let's see if we can't watch the video. I'm gonna stop sharing this screen and I'm gonna move to sharing my video screen. Right. Good luck, because I'm not tech savvy.
When it comes to collecting stormwater samples, there are compliant techniques and not so compliant techniques that you can use to get the job done. Hi, I'm Shutha Rastagarpur with the Division of Water Quality at the State Water Resources Control Board. And in
Aaron, you just lost the sound. You might need to unmute yourself.
Okay, so I'm gonna get some feedback. I hope the sound is coming through. Rebecca, are we getting is it coming
The
through?
sound was coming through until you muted yourself and then we lost it.
Oh, that's weird. Okay, let me back it up. Here we go.
industrial stormwater practitioners some guidance and practical tips for collecting representative stormwater samples.
I'm Brandon Rosenblum, also with the Division of Water Quality at the State Water Resources Control Board. Many times, collecting a representative sample is a combination of good planning and adapting to current conditions. The goal of this video is not to give you a stormwater sampling manual, but rather to share important concepts that will help you think on your feet and collect a representative sample out in the real world.
Yes, every facility is different, so there's no one-size-fits-all approach. What you see in this video might work for one facility and not another. Try to see past the specific examples and look for the underlying concepts which apply to each facility.
Before we get started though, this video is not intended to be a stormwater sampling crash course. There are a few things that we are expecting you to know. As a quiz, you should have a working knowledge of the California Water Board's Industrial General Permit and its sampling requirements. The facility you are working with should also have a compliance SWIP in place with a description of the facility's discharge points, sampling locations, and the required sampling parameters.
You should also have a working relationship with an analytical laboratory that is part of the Environmental Laboratory Accreditation Program, also known as ELAB. You should have a sample kit with the correct number and types of laboratory supplied sample containers for the facility. Furthermore, you should know how to fill out the chain of custody form and determine how the samples will be delivered to the lab within the appropriate holding times. You should also be familiar with the discharge characteristics of the facility, the time constraints for sampling storm events, and how many sampling events are required. Also, you should research and know any exceptions to the sampling requirements, such as unsafe conditions, outside of facility operating hours, and such. But requirements can change with time, so make sure you check with the current industrial general permit.
Think through the facility operating hours and make sure a sampler is ready to respond during normal operating hours. So, why do we collect stormwater samples? What are we trying to determine?
The California Water Board's Industrial General Permit requires each facility operator to sample stormwater runoff discharging from their property in order to gauge the effectiveness of their pollution prevention program and best management practices.
And because these stormwater samples are evaluating the facility's effectiveness at preventing or removing pollutants, they should be representative. What does representative mean? Well, a representative sample gives an unbiased snapshot of stormwater quality associated with the facility's industrial activity.
A representative sample should not be the cleanest water you can find, and it also shouldn't be the dirtiest. You can think of a representative sample as reflecting the average quality of the facility's stormwater runoff. When, where, and how a sample is collected can greatly impact how representative it is. And be careful about run-on from neighboring sites and from non-industrial areas.
Most of the time, the location for collecting a representative sample will be determined ahead of time by the quiz and should be reliable. But in the field, things can change. High water levels mean the original sampling location can be unsafe, or maybe water from the neighbor's property has backed up into your discharge point. You must be able to adapt, come up with a plan B, and still collect a representative sample. Stormwater samples are collected in order to get a realistic assessment of how well a stormwater management program is performing.
Ready to start? In this video, we are going to look at 3 very common sampling scenarios and talk through some approaches to collecting samples for each one.
Don't forget your sampling equipment, which may include a sample kit, drain grate hook, sample boom, chain of custody form, and pH meter. If you're going to be in traffic areas, bring some traffic cones too, but the exact equipment you need will be dependent on site-specific sampling logistics.
Let's check out our first scenario, Sheetflow.
One of the most common and challenging types of stormwater discharge to sample is sheetflow. Sheetflow is when stormwater doesn't collect in a ditch or channel, but runs off across the surface of a facility in a thin sheet.
Here, it looks like we have someone trying to grab a sheetflow sample using a dustpan, but it's not working out. Right about now, he is probably wishing he could make a low spot in the pavement. Let's think about this. Does this sample look representative of the water leaving his property? What about all the dirt he stirred up digging that hole?
This is definitely not the best way to collect a representative sheetflow sample. Let's go back and see what he did wrong. First of all, it looks like he was using a dustpan to try and collect his sample. Although this may sound like a reasonable way to collect a sample, the analytical method used for detecting oil and grease does not allow water samples to be transferred from container to container, or the result may be biased low. This extends to the sample collection. No intermediate containers or sample collection devices may be used to collect an oil and grease sample. Dustpans, pitchers, or plastic bags are not allowed. The oil tends to stick to the sides of the intermediate containers, removing it from the sample and causing inaccurate analytical results.
If you're using automatic samplers, things get a little complicated. We're not going to get into the details of using auto samplers in this video, but you should know that auto samplers must be specifically designed to handle parameters like oil and grease and pH. Another problem is that he is contaminating the stormwater sample by stepping in the water that he is sampling. The sample collector should always stand downstream or out of the water flow if possible.
Our sample is then in the nearby gravel and then uses his dustpan to collect the water. It turns out he's onto something here, but this is definitely the wrong approach. The sediment disturbed by digging ends up in his stormwater sample. That is not representative of what was flowing off his site. And he's still using the dustpan, so sorry, pal.
Now, we asked the quiz to look at the sampling location and suggest a better way to collect stormwater samples without breaking the bank or installing any major modifications. This is what she came up with.
But remember, although this is a better sampling solution for a particular discharge point, it might not work at your facility. Pay attention to the concepts used here, not the specifics.
When the quiz saw this sampling location, she saw the need for 2 things. First, some sort of low spot must be installed to allow the sample bottles to be filled directly without using a secondary container. This problem was solved by installing a small underground pull box at the sampling location. The pull box is deep enough to accommodate the sample bottles. When not collecting samples, the lid is left closed and the stormwater flows over the full box and discharges offsite. Second, the flow must be increased or concentrated in some way to make it easier to collect the sample.
Whenever you are collecting samples, it is important to pay attention to your safety. Many times, your sample collection point might be in a vehicle or equipment traffic area. Not a great place to be working close to the ground. Make sure you are visible, and if possible, use the buddy system.
Personal protective equipment is also important. Sampling usually involves cold weather conditions, slippery surfaces, caustic chemicals, and dirty water. Make sure you're wearing appropriate clothing and footwear and use powder-free gloves and eye protection when handling stormwater or sample bottles. Also, don't forget about other PPE that may be required by your facility.
Avoid smoking, eating, or drinking while collecting samples. Not only is it not safe, but there is a chance you can contaminate your sample.
Now, let's move on to our second scenario, drain inlets. Collecting representative stormwater samples from drain inlets can be challenging, especially if there is a drain insert bag or other BMP installed, like in this case.
It looks like our sample here is struggling with the drain insert bag. Having drain insert bags installed at sampling locations is almost always a problem, because at any time the bag is disturbed, it releases trapped pollutants and sediment back into the stormwater and right into your sample bottle.
It looks like he's collecting a sample from the conveyance pipe at the bottom of the catch basin. Remember, looking for representative stormwater samples, and what our sampler did here was not the best way to capture a representative sample from a drain inlet. Let's see what he did wrong and find out what he could do better. The first problem that we see here is the facility has installed a drain bag at their sampling point. Drain bags can be great BMPs, but having one installed at your sample point can make it difficult to grab a representative sample, especially here where it looks like the holding straps have become weathered and brittle. Remember, samples should be collected after the BMP, which in this case results in a bunch of sediment being released and flowing right where he is collecting his sample.
The second problem is that our sampler is not using good sampling technique. It looks like there is not a lot of flow in this drain, so he is scraping the bottom of the catch basin to fill up his sample bottle. This is not a representative sample because he is stirring up and sampling whatever material might have been lying at the bottom of this catch basin, which may contain pollutants left over from years past, or may have come from non-industrial sources. At any rate, it is not representative of the water leaving the facility. And if there is any preservative in the laboratory supplied sample bottle, he lost it while scraping the bottom of the catch basin and disqualified the sample. Unfortunately, these problems with sampling technique caused high analytical results, which were noticed by the water boards. The facility was inspected by the Regional Water Quality Control Board, who issued a notice of violation for inadequate sampling protocols and a non-compliance monitoring program. The facility contracted with a QUISP to respond to the violation. Let's see what the QUISP recommended for a better sampling setup.
In addition to more regular sweeping and good housekeeping, the QUISP recommended that the facility remove the drain insert bag and replace it with a drop-in filter unit with a sampling port. And after studying the facility's drainage system, the QUISP determined that the most representative sample from this drain inlet should come from the water flowing into the drain, not from the water flowing in the stormwater pipe down below.
This does two things. First, by installing a plastic drop-in filter with a sampling port, the BMP no longer has to be disturbed when collecting a sample. This means all of that sediment captured by the BMP will stay put until it can be cleaned and disposed of. Second, the drain insert funnels all of the water flowing into the drain through the filtration unit and out through a single opening in the bottom. This provides the sampler with a representative and post-BMP sample of the water flowing into the drain.
It is important to know where you should take the sample in the drain inlet. This depends on each particular drain and drainage system. In this case, the sampler collected samples from the drain line at the bottom of the catch basin. But because of possible commingling in the drain line, the QUISP determined a sample from the water flowing into the drain would be more representative.
Also, remember how the sampler was scraping the bottom of the catch basin while collecting the sample? This brings up a good point. You should never touch the sides or surface of the drain inlet with the sample bottle. You might contaminate the sample or break the glass bottle.
Don't forget about safety. Did you notice the traffic cones? If you're in an area with vehicle traffic, make sure you're visible.
Okay, let's move on to our last example, manholes.
Taking stormwater samples from a manhole is a little less complicated than sheet flow or drain inlet samples, but there are still a few things you need to consider.
It looks like he's using a sample booth, which is good. Keep in mind that manholes are confined spaces. You should never enter a manhole without a confined space entry permit and proper training.
But it looks like he's having trouble collecting a sample from the bottom of the manhole, so he is just filling up his bottle from that other pipe.
The problem is, we don't know where that pipe is coming from. And if he was supposed to collect a sample from the conveyance pipe, sampling from that other pipe is not a representative sample. Let's see how the QUISP approaches the situation.
After studying the facility's drainage system, the QUIS determined that the water from both lines was industrial stormwater runoff and that a representative sample should be taken after the water coming out of the pipe commingles with the water in the conveyance line. In order to solve the low flow situation, the QUIS recommended that the facility install a weir inside the manhole, which should be epoxy to the side of the manhole to prevent leaks. The weir would cause the water to back up inside the line, eventually becoming deep enough to collect a sample with the sample bottle.
One thing to be aware of when installing a weir like this is that it changes when your facility discharges. Only collect samples after the water flows over the weir and any initially impounded water is cleared from the system. A system like this will also require maintenance. The area upstream of the weir will tend to fill up with sediment and other pollutants and will need regular inspections and cleaning.
Okay, let's summarize. The purpose of this video is to give you general guidance, not an exhaustive sampling manual.
There are many things that we didn't cover about collecting stormwater samples, but that are important for you to know.
Make sure to read the current industrial general permit, especially those sections relating to stormwater monitoring and sampling.
The most important thing that you should learn from this video is the concept of representative sampling. As a QUISP, you must look at the facility's drainage system and figure out the most representative sampling locations.
Collecting stormwater samples is not just about filling up bottles, it's about getting an accurate snapshot of the facility's stormwater quality. It determines the facility's public compliance story. The data informs future facility investments in BMPs, and high-quality statewide data helps inform the Water Board's future permit development. I'm Shuka with the State Water Board.
And I'm Brandon with the State Water Board.
Happy sampling.
Hi, everybody. Well, I really like that video because it basically touched on all the things that I was talking on. The whole point of representative sampling, the whole point of, I don't know if you noticed, but when they were grabbing that one sample at the bottom of the drain, how it was scraping and gouging, which we recommended against. I don't know if you remember, I talked about how when you pull your bags off, what happens? There goes your BMPs. I can't tell you how many people I've seen do that. So there's a lot of good information. Again, it was designed for people with my certification, but there's so much good information in there. I really feel compelled and got permission from the Water Board to share that in our training. So are there any questions right now I can field?
Yes, Aaron, there's a couple questions that came in earlier. So we have one that says, is there an expiration of sample containers, i.e. can a leftover sample for 2022-23 be used for 23-24?
Most labs I talk to recommend not keeping them more than a year. If you have samples from last year, they're probably good. However, most labs will tell you it's better to get them updated annually.
Okay. And then we have a question, if the water leaving our property is from a storm drain, where do we get the samples from? Above the grate?
Good question. You're supposed to collect representative samples. So if water in your facility goes into storm drains and it leaves out through storm drains and goes out, you need to find the drain where last place where water leaves the property and grab a sample from there, because that's representative. If your storm drains, like I have one client in Stockton where they have storm drains, they have 4 storm drains on the back of their property. but this whole street, north to south, has a pipe that runs and every business connects in or taps into that drain. So they can't grab samples from at the drain at the bottom because it's water from everybody up downstream, which is basically flows from the south to the north. And so they can't grab samples from just the last drain on their property from the flow of water because they're picking up water from other places. So what they had to do was basically make 4 outfalls. Each drain in their yard had to be collected as a separate discharge point because it taps into a generalized one. So to answer your question, and I've had some facilities that are a combination of the two. Part of their property goes into a storm drain and leaves out a storm drain. So we grab samples from inside that storm drain. But part of their property sheet flows and leaves from another conveyance area. It goes through a ditch and leaves that way. So basically they had 2 outfalls, one from inside the drain where water left, and one from sheet flow area where it was leaving through industrial areas and out. Now, quick context. The water board considers parking lots to be non-industrial. So if you have storm drains or runoff from an area that's just parking, it has no industrial activity, that's a non-industrial area, you don't grab samples from there. You only grab samples from water where you do industrial activity. And basically they have you can go to the permit and it kind of explains all that for you. But the bottom line is, if you want to grab samples from inside the drain, if all the drains feed into it and it leaves, from that's the ideal. Like I have one client here in Lodi where they have like 7 or 8 drains, but they all end up at one spot and leave from that one drain. So they grab a sample from that one drain. It's representative because everything goes to that spot. Whereas another one I did Stockton years ago, they had bought out a facility and the facility had been purchased from the city and it had 2 sides of the street. And so basically they had several storm drains and actually their facility set in the middle of a former actual street. So a lot of the storm drains were connected. They had outside connections coming from off of Lincoln and just all types of crazy things. So they had just like my other client in Stockton where they had grabbed samples from each outfall, they had some of the drains connected together and they grabbed samples from the last drain. Other drains they had to consider as an individual outfall because it went into a public waterway underneath. So I hope that answers your questions.
Okay, and we have another one. Is the 4-hour sampling time after start of discharge for each discharge location in a facility? Example, if there are 2 discharge locations and one location discharged at 11 a.m. and the other location began discharge at 2 p.m., do we have till 3 p.m. to sample the first discharge point until 6 p.m. to sample the second discharge location?
Yes, it's based per outfall. So it's discharged from the individual outfall. So if one outfall starts discharging at 11, that's when the clock starts. If another one starts discharging at 2, that's when the clock starts. It's based per outfall, not based on whichever one comes first. The water board clarified that a few years ago. I think in 2017, it came out with a clarification because if you look at the language of the permit, it's a little hazy. It says, from any discharge location. What they meant is any discharge location that leaves, that's where the clock starts for that location.
Okay, fantastic. It looks like that's it for questions as of right now. If you have a question that hasn't been answered, go ahead and put it in the chat. But we do have 2 more workshops online for today, and then we have 2 in person. So the next online ones are how to safely manage stormwater with PFAS and stormwater pollution abatement. And so you can sign up for both of those workshops on our website, which is stormwaterawareness.org. And if you missed any part of this workshop or any part of this 3-part series, they will be available to watch about 24 to 48 hours from now on our website. And you can also see the remainder of the workshops that happened yesterday and are still to happen the rest of this week. But thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you, Aaron, for presenting.
My pleasure. Thank you for joining us. Take care now.